The frozen wilderness of Montana is no place for the weak, where winter's chill conceals as much danger as beauty. Life and death dance on the razor's edge. A lone lynx cub, alone and starving, too young to fend for himself, steps into a world far crueler than he ever imagined. The shadows move. The snow whispers. He suddenly finds his world turned upside down when a pack of wolves closes in. A wolf pack, hardened by winter's grip, has marked him as their next meal. But fate is unpredictable. As the wolves close in and all hope seems lost, an unexpected force intervenes, setting off a chain of events that defies nature's most ruthless rules. The wild reveals a twist that changes everything we think we know. Prepare to witness a story where survival instinct and courage collide in the icy grip of winter, where nature's balance may never be the same. The bitter wind howled through the dense pine forest of northern Montana, carrying with it tiny ice crystals that sparkled like diamond dust in the weak winter sunlight. It was early February, and the Flathead National Forest lay buried under 3 feet of snow, its usual verdant expanse transformed into an unforgiving white wilderness. For Max, a 4-month-old lynx cub, the world had become a terrifying place. His mother had vanished 3 days ago while hunting, leaving him alone in their den beneath a fallen spruce. Hunger had finally driven him into the open, his small body trembling from both the cold and fear. His spotted coat stood out against the snow as he crept forward, his tufted ears twitching at every unfamiliar sound. 20 miles away, Jim Harrison adjusted his heavy winter coat, preparing for another day of wildlife monitoring. A seasoned biologist, he had spent decades studying Montana's predators. His daughter, Sarah, a dedicated wildlife veterinarian, handed him a thermos. "Wolves are getting bolder," she warned. Jim nodded, unaware that today would test everything he believed about nature's balance. Out in the wilderness, Max unknowingly stepped into danger that would arrive on silent pause before the day's end. Max's paws sank into the snow with each careful step. His stomach ached from days without food, but his instincts urged him forward. His mother had begun teaching him to hunt, yet he lacked the skills to catch prey on his own. The wind carried the faint scent of something promising, a red squirrel, perhaps, or a pine marten. Max crouched low, his muscles tensed. His keen, golden eyes locked onto a flicker of movement between the trees. Then, another sound. Not prey. Something larger. The crunch of multiple paws pressing into fresh snow sent a chill through Max's body. He turned sharply, his tufted ears flattening against his head. A pack of wolves emerged from the trees, moving like silent specters through the frozen landscape. Their leader, Shadow, a battle-scarred alpha female, lowered her head, amber eyes fixed on the young lynx. Max froze. Shadow stepped forward, her thick gray coat bristling. To her right, her massive mate, a wolf with a distinctive white chest, blocked the escape route. 3 younger wolves completed the formation, their tongues flicking over their teeth in anticipation. Max's heart pounded. His mother had warned him about wolves. But nothing could prepare him for this. Far away, Jim Harrison scanned the snowy expanse through his binoculars. The wilderness was eerily quiet, save for the occasional groan of ice shifting under the weight of winter. He had just finished checking a monitoring station when something pierced the silence. A high-pitched cry. Desperate. Young. Jim stiffened. That was no ordinary animal call, it was a distress cry. Years of experience told him something was terribly wrong. He tightened his grip on his tranquilizer gun, his body moving before his mind could fully process the situation. A life was in danger. Meanwhile, Max's every instinct screamed run, but where? The wolves had him surrounded. He arched his back, bristling his fur to appear larger. His small frame trembled, but he refused to submit. He hissed, baring tiny, sharp teeth. A warning, one he knew wouldn't be enough. The wolves inched closer, their breath visible in the freezing air. Shadow took another step forward. The pack was moments away from striking. Jim pushed through the snow-covered underbrush, following the cries. His snowshoes crunched over ice, but he moved with trained efficiency. The sound grew louder, his pulse quickened. He wasn't far. Then, as he crested a ridge, the scene below made his breath catch. A lone lynx cub, barely 4 months old, was backed against a rocky outcropping. 5 wolves loomed around him, their predatory gaze locked onto the trembling feline. For a split second, Jim hesitated. He had spent his life respecting the rules of nature. Predation was a natural cycle. But watching the young lynx stand his ground against impossible odds, something in him shifted. Shadow's muscles tensed. The fatal strike was coming. Jim had to act. Now. Jim's breath clouded in the freezing air as he assessed the situation. The wolves were ready to strike. Shadow lowered her head, her amber eyes locked onto the trembling lynx cub. The younger wolves, eager and hungry, edged forward, muscles coiled. Jim's instincts screamed at him. Interfering with a predator-prey interaction was against everything he had been trained to do. But this wasn't just a scientific observation. This was survival. He reached into his pack and pulled out a wolf deterrent canister, a device of his own design, combining an ultrasonic frequency with a scent that mimicked the presence of a rival predator. It wasn't a weapon. It was a message. A challenge. With a practiced flick, he activated the canister and threw it into the snow between the wolves and Max. A high-pitched frequency split the air, piercing through the silence like a siren. The effect was immediate. Shadow jerked her head up, her ears flattening against her skull. The other wolves hesitated, their eyes darting between their leader and the unfamiliar disturbance. Then the scent hit them, a manufactured blend mimicking the pheromones of a grizzly bear, their most feared competition. The pack faltered. Uncertainty crept in. Jim stepped forward, deliberately slow, his body radiating confidence rather than aggression. Wolves were intelligent, cautious creatures. They knew how to measure risk. Easy, Shadow, Jim murmured. His hand hovered over his tranquilizer gun, though he hoped he wouldn't have to use it. There's easier prey out there for you and yours. Shadow held his gaze. It was a battle of wills. Max, despite his terror, refused to cower. His tufted ears were pinned back, his tiny body still bristling with defiance. Even facing certain death, he stood his ground. For a long, agonizing moment, the only sound was the distant howl of the wind. Then, Shadow made her decision. The alpha female threw back her head and let out a single, clipped howl. A signal. A command. The wolves, one by one, melted into the trees, their ghostly forms vanishing into the white wilderness. Shadow was the last to leave, her piercing eyes lingering on Jim before she turned and disappeared. The danger had passed. But Max's fight was far from over. Jim exhaled, the weight of the moment settling over him. He had saved the lynx. Now, he had to make sure it survived. Jim knelt in the snow, his breath steadying as he took in the sight of the tiny lynx cub pressed against the rock. Max's sides heaved with exhaustion, his thin frame trembling. Up close, Jim could see just how malnourished the cub was, his ribs pressed against his spotted fur, his limbs frail. He wouldn't survive the night alone. Moving carefully, Jim removed his heavy jacket and draped it over Max. The cub flinched but didn't resist. He was too weak to fight, too drained to run. "You've had one hell of a day," Jim murmured, his voice calm, reassuring. "Let's get you somewhere safe." Securing Max in the folds of his jacket, Jim cradled the cub against his chest. He retrieved his radio with his free hand and pressed the call button. Static crackled. Then Sarah's voice came through. "Dad? What's wrong?" "Got a young lynx cub. Probably 4 months old. Severely malnourished, dehydrated. Just barely made it out of a run-in with wolves." A brief silence. Then Sarah's voice, sharper now. "Can he move?" "Barely. I'm bringing him in." The drive back to the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center was tense. Every few minutes, Jim glanced down at Max, who had curled into the warmth of the jacket. The cub's eyes fluttered but never fully closed. He was exhausted, yet he clung to awareness, his instincts unwilling to surrender. As Jim pulled into the facility's back entrance, Sarah was already waiting, her dark hair tied back, medical gear in hand. Her expression softened the moment she saw Max. "Oh, Dad, he's beautiful." Jim carefully transferred the cub into her arms. Max had survived the wolves. Now, his fight for survival truly began. The next few days were critical. Max was dangerously weak, dehydrated, and underweight. Sarah and her team worked tirelessly, administering fluids and monitoring his vitals. The lynx cub barely moved at first, his body too exhausted to fight. Yet, his spirit remained unbroken. He had survived the wolves, he wasn't giving up now. Weeks passed. Slowly, Max regained his strength. His appetite returned, his coat grew thick and glossy, and his legs, once frail, became powerful. Sarah introduced him to a controlled environment where he could learn essential survival skills: stalking, pouncing, and hunting. Meanwhile, Jim continued tracking Shadow's wolf pack. Despite their failed hunt, they had moved to a different hunting ground, successfully taking down an elk. The balance of nature had restored itself. As the months passed, Max proved himself a true survivor. He no longer relied on human care, he was ready. Spring arrived, and with it, the day of his release. Jim and Sarah carefully transported Max to a secluded area, rich with prey, far from wolf territory. As they opened the transport cage, Max hesitated. He turned back for a fleeting moment, his golden eyes locking onto Jim's. Then, with the same quiet determination he had shown against the wolves, he disappeared into the wild. Years later, Jim was surveying the wilderness when he stumbled upon a familiar sight, a lynx den, nestled beneath a rocky outcrop. He crouched, his heart pounding as he spotted a fully grown lynx with piercing golden eyes. Max. Beside him, nestled in the shadows, two small cubs peeked out. Jim smiled. Max had not only survived, he had thrived. As Jim stepped back, Max didn't run. For a brief moment, predator and protector shared a silent understanding. Then, Max turned, leading his cubs deeper into the wilderness. Jim exhaled, watching them vanish into the forest. The cycle of life continued, stronger than ever. Max's story wasn't just about survival. It was a testament to resilience, balance, and the power of second chances.